Following a decade of over nothing but success after success, by the end of the 1990s, Square were forced to come to terms with one simple fact. Even though their mainline Final Fantasy games were selling in the millions and generating hundreds of millions of dollars in revenue, almost everything else at the company was starting to fall apart at the seams. The IPs that had coexisted alongside Final Fantasy throughout the 8-bit and 16-bit era were just no longer performing as they once were, and this was compounded by new, original games being unable to satisfy the lofty demands put in place by a board of directors that was becoming increasingly more interested in money and satisfying their shareholders. Throughout the PlayStation era, this saw games such as Xenogears, Chrono Cross, and Vagrant Story positioned as commercial failures, despite the former generating approximately $57 million at the time, and the latter generating just shy of $30 million. In isolation, that represented solid performance, and both games were no doubt profitable. But when compared to the likes of Final Fantasy IX, which generated over $250 million against a budget of $40 million, the returns were rather paltry. The self-determined lackluster performance of everything non-Final Fantasy was then exacerbated by a gamble taken by Hironobu Sakaguchi. Square had hoped to capitalize on the increased spectacle of animated movies, and were enthused by Toy Story making almost $400 million on a budget of only $30 million. That was less than Final Fantasy VII, VIII, and IX had cost to make, and the returns were similar, if not larger. The gamble was to therefore produce their own movie, using all of their know-how with storytelling and their expertise with animation that they had gained from working on FMV sequences that were used in games like Final Fantasy VIII, IX, and other games throughout the era like Parasite Eve. But despite their best intentions, the spirits within struggled. Production costs skyrocketed due to Square underestimating the movie-making process, and these costs, when combined with their non-Final Fantasy games not selling as well as they'd hoped, Play Online development not going that smoothly, and Final Fantasy X being delayed, it meant Square posted their first public financial loss since they began trading in 1994. As a consequence, heads rolled. Tomoyuki Takechi, the president and chairman of the board, resigned with immediate effect, and he was joined by Masashi Hiromatsu, the CEO who also served as the director of Square Europe, and Hironobu Sakaguchi. The following year was turbulent to say the least. Hisashi Suzuki, who was one of the company's first employees, was appointed as the new president in a show of strength. He implemented mass cost-cutting measures, and there was a huge reduction in headcount. Many of the so-called old guard ended up leaving during this period, wanting to forge their own path, and they just weren't replaced. Alongside the promotion of Suzuki, Square also hired a new suite of executive directors. They were from a multitude of different industries, and the hope was that they would use their expertise to solidify Square's position and create a new foundation. Amongst them were an external director called Makoto Naruke, who served as the president of Microsoft Japan, and a man named Yuichi Wada. Wada had no explicit experience with video games, having worked in more traditional settings throughout his career. But one thing he did understand was how to make companies efficient and coordinated. After joining Square as an executive officer in April of the year 2000, Wada was then promoted to chief financial officer after just 2 months. The following year, he was then made chief operating officer, before being promoted to president and CEO in December of 2001. During this time, Wada implemented sweeping organizational changes, including the establishment of 8 new streamlined development divisions, and he negotiated a timely investment deal with Sony, sold or closed ineffective parts of the business, and dissolved Square's partnership with Electronic Arts. But perhaps his biggest decision came with how Square handled the Final Fantasy franchise. It was baffling to Wada that each Final Fantasy game was treated as effectively a brand new IP, and that after up to 18 months in development, they just end up with one commodity that could then no longer really be used. With Sakaguchi no longer around as a blocker though, his big change was to remove such a ridiculous situation. He wanted Square to do much better at milking fans by squeezing all of the possible juice out of every single previous and future mainline Final Fantasy game. The objective was simple: sell fans what they really want in terms of concept, something that appeals to them several times over without them realizing it. And under the orders of Wada, Yoshinori Kitase started to explore how 2 stories that were never meant to be extended could be extended. The initial plan was to create a short movie based around Final Fantasy X that, after much consideration, was planned to be an extension of the original story. And the short movie was then to be packaged in with Final Fantasy X International. This approach aligned with a few of WADA's business goals. Final Fantasy X International was almost the same game as the original, it just had a bit more content. It meant fans were essentially being sold something that appealed to them several times over without realizing it. But by adding in this new short movie, which became known as Eternal Calm, the package was made all the more sweeter, as this was polymorphic content. It seemed quite innovative, but Square had been adopting this approach for some time. Final Fantasy 1 through 3 had numerous books published that either expanded the lore or proposed alternate retellings. There was also plans for a Final Fantasy 4 comic book, and a sequel to Final Fantasy 5 was produced. Sakaguchi was just adamant that any expansion that happened did so outside of the medium of video games. The only exceptions to this were international versions, of which Final Fantasy VII had one already. That may have been the case here too, that Eternal Calm was just created as a cheap and effective way of driving sales of Final Fantasy X International. But once the creators saw the massive swell of interest after the release of the Eternal Calm movie, things changed, and the self-contained story ideal that had stayed with Final Fantasy for over a decade and 10 numbered games was thrown out of the window with immediate effect, as work began on not just one sequel to Final Fantasy X, but two. Amongst the original cast of characters, Tidus was undoubtedly the favourite. But due to how the story had concluded, the developers knew that using Tidus in a similar manner again was almost out of the question. This left them then looking at the rest of the cast, and Auron was again out of the question for a similar reason to Tidus. Kimahri, Lulu and Wakka had very much fulfilled supporting roles. Fans liked them, but there was no real desire to expand their stories or give them more exposure. That then left Yuna and Rikku. Both had established firm fan bases, albeit for different reasons, and Kitase plans to take advantage of this and the wider interest around Final Fantasy X, giving the green light to two Final Fantasy X spin-offs. The theory was that by splitting the sequel into two character-driven adventures, that fans of each heroine would be enthused. From a narrative perspective, not only would this give them the opportunity to explore different facets of Spira as it adapted to the new Calm, but they could do so first through the eyes of the now lauded summoner, and then through the eyes of her plucky, Albed Guardian. The other positive, which was based on WADA's ideologies, was that neither of these games would be very expensive to make. The assets were largely already created, the characters in the world were already established, and the team was very experienced with the engine. It meant both games could be created with a much leaner team than Final Fantasy X had required, and innovations could come from more superficial things such as tweaking the battle system. It meant both games, theoretically, could be turned around super quick and super cheap. In May 2002, Square then announced that a couple of games were in development based on Final Fantasy X, and they were being overseen by the new First Development Division. The plan, as announced, was for these games to expand to the stories of Yuna and Rikku, and they were to use the same game engine and take place in the same world. It was later revealed that they were codenamed Final Fantasy X Yuna version and Final Fantasy X Rikku version. The news was quite surprising for fans given the history of the franchise, but the most shocking aspect wasn't that these sequels were in production. Instead, it was that Square also announced that the games were to be both released in the forthcoming fiscal year. In other words, they were planned to release before the 1st of April 2003. This seemed rather unprecedented. Square had started to work on multiple Final Fantasy games simultaneously, as Final Fantasy IX, 10 and 11 were all in development at the same time. But this approach was only possible due to the adoption of multiple teams. They had also tried a similar approach many years prior by simultaneously working on Final Fantasy IV for the Famicom and V for the Super Famicom. That ended though with Final Fantasy IV for the Famicom being cancelled, and focus instead was placed on Final Fantasy V, which was rebranded to Final Fantasy IV. It's never been revealed how Square plans to fulfill the objective this time around. Perhaps they believed the original Final Fantasy X team could be split down the middle, with half working on the Yuna version and half working on the Rikku version. Or perhaps they planned to work on one before shifting focus to the other. We'll probably never know, as after it was announced to the public, the plan to release two separate follow-ups to Final Fantasy X unraveled pretty quickly. After the announcement in May, First Development Division continued their work on both games. However, at some point they realized that the approach just wasn't going to work. This realization was then made public some 5 months later. On the 22nd of October 2002, Square unveiled Final Fantasy X-2 to shareholders in Japan, and it was given the release window of spring 2003, fulfilling that initial objective of releasing before the end of the fiscal year. As noted by GameSpot at the time, even though both Yuna and Riku featured amongst the playable cast, Yuna was quite clearly the focus. The story was also confirmed as being a direct follow-up to the Eternal Calm short movie. However, the narrative was adjusted. Whereas the short movie had positioned Tidus as being the person in the sphere, it was now changed to being a brand new character who just looked like Tidus. And that was to be the impetus for this new quest. On the same day, as reported by GamePro, it was also confirmed to Famitsu via an interview with some of the senior development team that Final Fantasy X codename Riku had been cancelled. No specific reason was ever given for the decision, but one of the developers did note to Famitsu that if Final Fantasy X-2 performed well and there was appetite within the team, that the story had been written in such a way that should they ever wish to make a direct sequel, there was enough crossover material there. But that was the last we ever heard of Final Fantasy X, codename Riku. Final Fantasy X-2 though did have its story expanded upon further, it just wasn't in the same vein as had initially been promised or then teased. A year after the release of Final Fantasy X-2, the then Square Enix went to market with Final Fantasy X-2 Last Mission. This was packaged in with the international version of the game and featured a story that took place 3 months after the conclusion of the main story. It adopted a much more somber tone, as the 3 characters ended up making some stark realizations about their own lives and the collective relationships. Even though Riku did feature with prominence, and perhaps had the harshest reality check, she was no more the main protagonist than Yuna or Pain. But how things concluded did open the door for a standalone adventure focused on Riku, if that was what Square wanted to do. However, by this point, First Development Division had already started work on the initial PlayStation 2 version of Final Fantasy XIII. As time then passed, Final Fantasy X was then further expanded, first with a novel, and then an audio drama that was packaged in with the Final Fantasy X 10.2 HD remaster. But Riku did not have a prominent role in the novel, nor did she feature in the audio drama. And this means that any hope of codename Riku being revived is all but gone. With that though, we hope you enjoyed this exploration into the curious case of Final Fantasy X codename Riku. Please share in the comments below if you've enjoyed this focus on Riku. And if you enjoyed the video, feel free to hit that like button and subscribe for more. Alright everyone, with that, this is Daryl signing out. As always, I'd like to give a big thank you to all of our Patreon and YouTube membership supporters, especially Benjamin Snow, Chris M. Walker, Christopher Gardner, Clever Chavez, EXP Required on YouTube, Gregory, Nate Dogg, and Steven, who are super special Onion Knight supporters. And of course, a big thank you to everyone for watching this video. I'll see you all again soon for more Final Fantasy goodness.